In the aftermath of the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors sought refuge in historic Palestine, a land sacred to Muslims, Christians and Jews alike.
The General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine.
In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan for Palestine, aiming to create separate Jewish and Arab states. This proposal was rejected by the Palestinians, who were in the majority. The following year, the State of Israel was established, an event that led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and triggered the first Arab-Israeli war. This was a crucial juncture in Middle Eastern history, significantly shaping the region's political landscape, and ever since, millions of Palestinians have become refugees. For over 7 decades, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, has provided many with healthcare, education and various social services. But Israel's war on Gaza, ongoing since the Hamas attack in southern Israel on the 7th of October, has severely impacted the agency. Israeli airstrikes have hit tens of UNRWA's facilities and killed over 130 of its humanitarian workers, raising critical questions about the viability of the agency's continued operation under such challenging conditions. UNRWA's efforts were recognised at the Doha Forum 2023, and that's where we caught up with its Commissioner General. Philippe Lazzarini talks to Al Jazeera. Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, that's the UN Relief and Works Agency, one of the oldest parts of the United Nations. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. As I said, your agency is one of the first that was set up in the United Nations. You say now these are some of the darkest days in its history, and you yourself have had a very long career as a humanitarian. You've worked in places like the Balkans, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Iraq. Have you seen anything like this anywhere else before?
No, by any account, I haven't seen anything of this scale. Everything is absolutely unprecedented and staggering. The number of people who have been killed. Imagine, in 40 days, more women and children killed than the number of civilians in the Ukraine war. The level of destruction, it is said today that more than 60% of the infrastructure have been destroyed. The level of displacement of the population, more than 90% of the population has now been displaced and is now concentrated in the south. The number of UN staff which have been killed is absolutely unprecedented. The fact that we have more than 1 million displaced people in UN premises, in school, completely overcrowded, is absolutely unprecedented. So by any account, I have never seen something like that. Conditions are absolutely appalling. The sanitary conditions are terrible. There is hardly clean water. You start even to have some sewage water appearing in this shelter. I visited 2 weeks ago a family in one of the shelters. They were living in a kind of 4 square meters. They were sleeping on the floor without mattresses, without any blankets, still wearing the same clothes than 50 days, and basically spending the entire day to beg and find some food. And I was talking to the father, a father of 5 children, and all of a sudden he burst into tears and said, "But we feel completely humiliated. We feel treated like a human animal." And that was a few weeks ago. Since the offensive in the south have started, the offensive on Khan Yunis, and tens of additional thousands of people have been thrown on the road, are now going towards the south, and most of these people do not even have a place in this overcrowded shelter.
But they're not even shelters, some of them, are they? Because my understanding is over 90 of these places have been hit in the Israeli bombardment. You, I assume, share the coordinates of these places with the Israelis. Is there any excuse for places like this flying the UN flag to be hit?
You are right, and that shows that there is absolutely no safe space to be in the Gaza Strip. people first were asked to leave the north, and they have been instructed to evacuate the north during the bombardment. They went to the south, but we have seen that the south was not safer. More than 40% of the people who have been killed in the south, and the same applies with the UN. Indeed, it should be public infrastructure, the UN hospital, sheltering hundreds of thousands of people should be safe places. And we as a UN, indeed, are providing the geolocalization to the Israeli and also to to the Hamas. Everybody knows exactly where we are. And despite that, UN premises sheltering civilians have been hit. And we had, until today, more than 270 people killed in these places and nearly 1,000 people injured.
When your agency was set up in 1949, it was set up under a mandate from the UN General Assembly, and you've now taken an unprecedented step of sending this letter to the President of the General Assembly, raising the alarm, saying that you now don't have the ability to carry out your work as you want. You say it's severely limited. In the letter, let me just quote, "In my 35 years in complex emergencies, I've never written such a letter predicting the killing of my staff and the collapse of the mandate I'm expected to fulfill." Why did you write that letter, and what do you hope the General Assembly can do?
I report back to the General Assembly. UNRWA has been created through a mandate of the General Assembly. And I do believe it is of utmost importance that the member of the General Assembly realize that if UNRWA collapses in Gaza, that the Palestinian community will feel that this is the last betrayal of the international community. And basically, if we cannot operate, no one else will be able to provide humanitarian assistance to the 2 million Gazans currently in this war zone. So my message was to say, if we collapse, I will not be able anymore to fulfill the mandate. And the situation is so severe that I also know that my staff might not be able to operate anymore. I indicated in this letter that many of my staff now come with their children to work because they are afraid not to see the children at the end of the day, or at least to be sure that if they have to die, they die together.
Over 130 UNRWA workers killed. Those are people who worked for you. Is it hard sometimes to separate your feelings?
It's extremely hard, but I tell you also a story. You know, the second time I went to Gaza, I asked one staff who, you know, has a PhD, was a senior manager, has his children at university, represented the kind of upper middle class, who basically, like anyone else in the Gaza Strip, has lost everything. And his children basically are even questioning, why, Dad, did you send us to school and to learn all this principle of human rights? And I asked him, how do you do to be so composed? And he answered to me, I'm not composed, I just struggle 10 times a day. I try to find a corner in this building to go to cry. I need to cry.
And if you look at the population of Gaza, more than 1 million people there are children. When you look at the bombardment and that fact, does it make you angry?
What makes me angry is the indifference of the international community. We see this under our watch 24 hours a day. It's not that we don't know. And still, I feel that there is a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy, that in a certain extent, we have dehumanized all this to make the unbearable bearable. And this is what is really making me angry, but beyond that also extremely worried, because what does it tell if a society starts to properly lose its empathy? By this, we are losing our humanity.
You've said that we may soon reach the point of no return in Gaza. If you look at the scale of destruction, which is immense, 60% of homes have been destroyed, 85% of the population has been forced from their homes. Has Gaza already been made uninhabitable?
That's a very good question. There are facts on the ground which are being created, which indeed might make Gaza uninhabitable. I don't think that conditions are met anytime soon for a large-scale return of the population, for example, in the north. The north has been completely destroyed, and now the south is also being destroyed. But beyond that, you know, there are a number of people who do not see their future anymore in Gaza. They have it. They have it. 5 conflicts, 6 conflicts since 2005, and this one has been the massive blow for all of them. So they do not even necessarily see the future in the Gaza Strip. So we might have, through this also, build or set up the condition for people not willing or being able to return.
Your boss, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has warned that the situation creates increased pressure for mass displacement into Egypt. And let me also read you this quote from the humanitarian director of Oxfam, the aid agency. "We fear that masses of terrified people will be forced beyond Gaza itself under the guise of safety. And this would force the humanitarian system into an impossible choice between helping civilians and being complicit in their forced deportation." Do you agree with that point?
Over the last 2 months, people have been already forced to move. They have been forced displacement from the north to the south, in the south into tinier area, which are area which, by the way, cannot afford anymore to host such a large number of people. So I agree that the pressure today of people completely desperate, having absolutely nothing to lose, might be such that they might be tempted indeed to cross the border, despite the fact that a number of countries have said that this would be a red line. We do not want this forced transfer of population outside the boundary of Gaza. But in reality, out of despair, if you have hundreds of thousands of people being in Rafah in the open and having no other alternative, they might be tempted.
Both you and the Secretary-General have warned of a complete collapse of public order. Just expand on that to me. What would that look like?
It has already started. It's a kind of lawlessness. Imagine we had a situation where trucks started to enter into Gaza, but even before being able to reach their destination, being shelter, where we have shelter in Rafah or in Khan Yunis, or even a warehouse, they have been stopped by hundreds of people in the street, hungry people, who basically stopped them and took the food. And we had the scene where once they have taken the food, it's not to take it home, but it was to eat it on the spot. We hear more and more that people, children, haven't eaten for the last 2 or 3 days, for example. And we should not forget that after two months of a conflict and 2 months of constant movement, 2 months of almost total siege and total depossession, the immunity of the people has also drastically weakened.
You talk about the lack of food, which is clearly one of the huge problems there. It brings me on to 2 other big fears. One is starvation. The other is disease. Let's take those one by one. How worried are you about starvation in Gaza?
I think there is hunger. We are not yet on famine or starvation, but the hunger is really present now in Gaza. And it's new. It never, ever happened. I have talked to many of my colleagues who told me that they have never heard about hunger in Gaza. And this has become a reality today. You have more and more children or families who have to skip food for 1 day, possibly even for 2 days. That's the kind of situation we are encountering right now. If you look at the few remaining bakeries, you have queues of thousands of people every morning trying to struggle and to fight to get their loaf of bread. So that's the kind of situation we are dealing with today.
And what about the risk of disease? What diseases are we talking about?
I believe, and I have warned more than once, that people might start now to die, not just because of the bombardment and the military operation, but they will also start to die because of the impact of the siege. And one of the impacts of the siege is the emergence of a disease outbreak. We are witnessing now an increased waterborne diseases, a lot of diarrhea in extraordinary unsanitary and appalling condition. We have seen also the emergence of hepatitis and quite a lot of skin diseases.
And there's not really a healthcare system anymore in Gaza, is there? I think 14 out of the 36 hospitals in the Gaza Strip are operating, but only doing very, very basic services now. The UN, have warned throughout the 2 months of this conflict that hospitals have to be protected. It's one of the basic tenets of international humanitarian law. Yet Israel has repeatedly struck hospitals, targeted hospitals repeatedly. These are war crimes, aren't they?
The determination of the crime will be investigated later on by international legal bodies. But it is true that in international humanitarian law, hospitals have to be respected, like civilians have to be respected. In this war, I know that the argument has always been, but it is a war in a crowded urban area. But that's the reason why in international humanitarian law, you have the principle of proportionality. Now, question is, can we still talk about proportionality when we talk about the staggering number we mentioned before about the number of people killed or the level of destruction in the Gaza Strip? Now, when it comes to hospital, in French I would say sacro-saint, that's the last place which should be hit in a conflict. It should be in the interest of anyone to keep medical facilities functioning. And unfortunately, this has not been the case. But we have seen also during this war, it was not only the hospital, but we were talking before about the UN premises. UN premises sheltering more than 1 million people have also been hit, and people have been killed in these places.
What about the aid coming into Gaza? It seems to be a trickle compared with what is needed right now. Back in November, the UN Security Council did pass a resolution asking for aid to be scaled up. Explain to me, what is the problem with why there are so few trucks coming in?
I think the primary problem is that the siege is imposed on Gaza. And at the beginning, it was a total siege. And after that, we started to negotiate a certain number of trucks coming into Gaza, which today, the good days, we might reach 150 to 200
But who
trucks.
decides that? That's the Israelis saying how many can come in.
That's on the Israeli side.
So they could have allowed many more trucks in at every stage if they wanted.
The siege has been decided and imposed by Israel. Then the crossing of Rafah has been opened. We see that the crossing of Rafah is, the entry point is a kind of a bottleneck. It cannot handle hundreds of trucks like other crossing used to do. If there is a political will, Kerem Shalom could be open, could be a crossing.
That's the crossing point. That's the crossing point from Israel into Gaza. Yes.
Exactly. And before October 7, that was the main crossing point for commercial trucks and humanitarian trucks entering into Gaza. Hundreds of them were processed on a daily basis, and that was at the time of a blockade, as we all know. So if there is a will, Kerem Shalom could be reopened, and the number of trucks entering into Gaza could significantly increase. But
and at any point in this conflict, Israel could have opened that crossing. It's a political decision by Israel not to do so.
There might have been certain time during the conflict that security would not have allowed the use of the crossing. But I do believe that the security environment in Kerem Shalom was not completely different than the one in Rafah. So again, yes, I think that if there is a proper political will, Kerem Shalom could be a crossing to be open.
In the Security Council on the 7th of December, the Israeli ambassador, Gilad Erdan, said, let me quote, There are currently hundreds of aid trucks in a logjam waiting to enter Gaza after security interception, and the only reason they've not entered is because of the logistical difficulties of international organisations. He's blaming this on you, the UN and the Red Crescent.
Yeah, you know, there are quite a lot of blame game, but the reality is that we have handled any trucks which has been sent and crossed the Rafah border. So there haven't been days where I heard that 200 trucks were queuing and waiting to enter into Gaza because the UN was not in a position to handle the truck, and this is untrue.
The appalling situation in Gaza clearly overshadows what's going on in the West Bank. But if there wasn't a war in Gaza, we'd be talking about the West Bank, wouldn't we? Because there's a record number of Palestinians who've been killed by Israeli forces there and by settlers, and there have been homes destroyed both in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem. What's your view of the situation there right now?
Well, you are so true. If the West Bank situation is overshadowed by Gaza, the West Bank is boiling. There is a kind of state of war taking place. The number of people who have been killed is also staggering compared to any previous year. It's a record year, in fact, in number of people having been killed. Number of incursions also in the various cities and camps are almost daily. We see also that the incursion, the Israeli incursion in the camps for security operation are becoming more and more brutal, because we see that public infrastructure during security operation are also destroyed. But beyond that, what worries me also is that the West Bank is also on the edge of a total economic collapse. We are ahead of a perfect storm.
Over the years, there have been quite a few stories that UNRWA has had to say are not true. Reports of anti-Semitic school books, of UNRWA facilities being used by Hamas. Recently, a widely retweeted claim that an UNRWA teacher was one of the guards for Hamas is Israeli captives. Do you think there's an organised campaign to discredit your organisation?
Oh, there is clearly organised campaign to discredit the organisation. The aim in reality is to liquidate the organization, because there is a belief that if UNRWA would not exist anymore, we would solve and address the problem of the Palestinian refugees. And by addressing the problem of the Palestinian refugees, we might find an easier political solution in the future. So
just to be clear, that's because UNRWA operates, in addition to Gaza and the West Bank, in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and these are Palestinians or their descendants who were forced from their homes in 1948 or 1967, and that means you are a link to these people who believe they have a right to return to their homeland. Is that right?
That's how the agency is also perceived by the Palestinian and the Palestinian refugees. But your question was on the detractor, and yes, indeed, there are orchestrated campaign to try to discredit the agency. Even now, in the context of the Gaza war, look in the social media how many try to depict that UNRWA is nothing else than an Hamas organization. People keep saying that all our staff is affiliated to Hamas, based on nothing, based on the fact that these are orchestrated disinformation campaign.
Finally, you, as we said at the beginning, have worked in this field for a very long time. One of your very first jobs for the International Committee of the Red Cross was based in Gaza. Tell me about the spirit and resilience of the Palestinian people and how that is being tested right now.
You know, when I started 30 years ago, it was the first Intifada. It was at the time of the Madrid process. It was tough because of the occupation, because of the Intifada, but it was a period full of hope, of aspiration, of a better future. And at that time also, Palestinian of Gaza knew the Israeli and vice versa. In every household in Gaza, you had someone speaking in Hebrew and vice versa, Israelis speaking Arab. Now, 30 years later, a young person of Gaza doesn't know anymore how an Israeli looks like, and vice versa. An Israeli would not know how a person from Gaza looked like. And over these last 30 years, this separation has completely dehumanized the relation between the Palestinian and the Israeli. And I don't think that this is a good recipe for the future of a two-state solution with two people living as neighbors. They need to know each other much better than that.
Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.